He is currently working on a book about the Egyptian labor. And I think Dr. Anderson goes first.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. We'll get the technical details sorted out here. I am going to be presenting a little bit of my research in the British Archives today. I wrote out my paper, so I hope you don't mind if I follow some stuffy conventions of the history discipline and read this out loud for you. In the village of Armant, in the upper Egyptian province of Inna, the village sheikh and the sheikh al-Khufara, or chief of police, were shot at and beaten to death by a group of villagers. In the melee, some of the Khufara fired on the crowd, killing 3 villagers and wounding 3 others. In the delta town of Farsakur, 26 men staged a sit-in in the Marquez prison and refused to leave for 2 days. A large crowd of local villagers gathered outside and cheered on the protesters to show their support for their cause. When the police tried to force their way into the prison, the assembled crowd began throwing stones at the police and tried to release the men who had staged the sit-in from the clutches of the police by force. The police responded by firing live ammunition at the crowd, and 4 villagers were wounded, including 3 women and 1 man. When the mullahis of police in the Biala outpost was preparing to leave for the Marquez Center in Talha, a crowd of about 200 villagers assembled to block his path. Some of the crowd struck the mullahis and other policemen stationed at the outpost, and 31 villagers were arrested in the effort to suppress the demonstration by force. All 3 of these acts that I've just mentioned happened within close succession of one another. But when did they take place? We would normally associate such a wave of violence sweeping through the Egyptian countryside and aimed at the infrastructures and personnel of the British colonial state with the March 1919 revolution that Dr. Abu al-Ghar just gave you the history of. But actually, these 3 events are all part of a wave of violence that took place between May and August of 1918, almost a year before the celebrated events of the 1919 revolution. This is what I am referring to in my presentation today as the 1918 Peasant Rebellion. The rebellion was not given much attention at all in the contemporary Egyptian press sources from that fateful summer. But this is hardly surprising, given that the press was under heavy censorship during the period of martial law that came with the First World War. But if we go to the British National Archives in London, we can find reports of at least 35 distinct yet connected and very violent repertoires of contentious politics emerging across the Egyptian countryside in the summer of 1918. At the British Archives, a large file titled "Raising of Personnel for an Egyptian Labor Corps to Undertake Loading and Unloading in French Military Ports" contains a series of correspondence between the British Foreign Office and British colonial officials attached to the Egyptian Ministry of Interior, marked with the series number 2689. This correspondence includes hundreds of pages of documents detailing how the British colonial state recruited Egyptian falahin to carry out military labor for the British Army during World War I. It spans 3 separate files, FO141/797, FO141/667, which is shown here, and FO141/798. This correspondence includes reports of the 1918 Peasant Rebellion, such as the one shown here from the Baliana Marquez, which took place on June 4th, 1918. The Peasant Rebellion arose in protest to the forced volunteering of hundreds of thousands of young men from the countryside of Egypt to serve as military laborers in the First World War. And of course, even though the British used the euphemism of volunteering to describe this process of young men going to work for the British in the war, the wave of violence that I'm discussing today, which erupted in response to this labor recruitment, shows that ELC recruitment, or recruitment for the Egyptian Labor Corps, was much more akin to forced conscription or even slavery. The Egyptian analog would be a sokhra, the corvée, which was a remnant of the Ottoman period in Egypt. So during World War I, Egyptians served as laborers in a variety of contexts. This is a picture here of a group of Egyptians working as stevedores on the docks of France and Flanders. And you can see in the foreground here this British officer who was commanding the Egyptian laborers. Egyptian laborers also worked during the First World War as camel drivers, supplying troops in the Sinai Desert and in the Western Desert fight against the Seleucia. Of course, the Sinai Desert going into Palestine and the Western Desert with the border on Libya, these areas had no roads or railroads when the war began. And so the immediate solution that the British came up with was to use camels to supply their troops. But where did they get these camels? Many of them were actually requisitioned for below market values from Egyptians, from rural Egyptian farmers in the countryside. And who drove these camels? It was, again, Egyptian laborers who had the expertise and experience who were recruited to drive these camels and supply British troops during World War I. Egyptian laborers also built the water pipeline and railways that allowed British troops to advance through Palestine and into the heart of Ottoman Syria. And this picture here shows Egyptian laborers. Looks like a pretty hot day. They are working on laying down the water pipeline that allowed for these soldiers to have fresh water to drink as they were advancing through the desert. And of course, these soldiers also needed a railway to supply them with their weapons and with their supplies. And so Egyptians, again, were tasked with laying these railroads across the Sinai Desert. And I have a picture here from the Australian War Memorial of Egyptians doing just this kind of work. So it is this massive recruitment of Egyptian laborers. Almost 500,000 Egyptians served in World War I. And this recruitment inspired